You can add pockets to your hand knit cardigan even after you've finished knitting, you've woven in the ends, you've washed and blocked, you've even worn it for a while, you can still add pockets. Let me show you how I added afterthought pockets to my cardigan. Hey nerdy knitter, Tanya here. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a master hand knitter, and the goal here at Nerdy Knitting is to help you become a more confident, adventurous knitter. And I want to talk about adding pockets to your cardigan, something that's really very simple to do. Before I show you how to actually make those pockets, I just want to talk quickly about the cardigan I'm wearing. This is Emma version C from the Cocoknits Sweater Workshop book. Now, the original pattern comes in 3 different versions. This is the open front tunic length cardigan version. The original pattern also did have pockets included, the sort of the side slit ones there where you would add fabric and make pockets and all of that. I didn't want them at the time. I had finished my whole sweater, I'd worn it for about a week, and then I decided, I would like some pockets, but there was no way I was going to rip out all that work to add those side slit pockets. So I decided I could do some patch pockets on the front, which is something you can add at any time on your hand knit sweaters and cardigans. There's actually 2 different ways to make afterthought patch pockets for your cardigans. In one method, you would pick up stitches where you want that pocket and you would actually knit it right onto the sweater or the cardigan. I've done this before for a cardigan for my daughter. Pocket looks really great and it works just fine, but with my cardigan, it's tunic length and it's bulky yarn, so it's heavier, and my sweater's larger than hers, and I was concerned that if I just knit them on, they would be, well, they'd be adding more weight of course, but they would be maybe more saggy because it's bulky yarn. When you just knit something on, it's not quite as sturdy. If you make something separate and sew it on, those seam lines provide a lot of additional structure to that garment, at least for shoulders and things like that. So I assumed it would be the same for pockets. So that's why I decided that I would make the pocket separately and sew it on instead of just sort of knitting it on right in place. But there are 2 different ways to do it. But the method I'm going to show today is how to make your pocket separately and then sew it right to your sweater or your cardigan. So the first thing to do is to decide on the placement of your pocket. So you want to use a yarn that is lighter than the yarn you're using, or even some embroidery floss if it's already like a light sweater. Mine is a bulky yarn, so I just grabbed some sock yarn in white, which was a nice big contrast for my green cardigan. And I outlined where I wanted that pocket to be. And there's a few things you want to keep in mind. You want to think about the stitch pattern you're using. If you're going to be putting like some ribbing across the top of that pocket, and I knew I was, then you want to make sure that you have a multiple that works for the ribbing you're using. For me, I wanted the same ribbing as the rest of the sweater, which is a knit 1, purl 1, which is automatically an even number. But if you do an even number, you start with a knit, you end with a purl, and with a pocket you want to start and end with the same stitch, and I wanted to start and end with a knit stitch. So I made sure I used an odd number when I was planning my pocket, because you trace out sort of where you want that pocket to be, the number of stitches wide and the number of stitches tall. So for the number of stitches wide, I made sure I had an odd number so I could start and end with a knit stitch. So the next step is to count the stitches in the rows that are in that space that you've marked out. So you count the number of stitches across. In my case, I wanted that odd number to make sure I could start the rib with the start and end with a knit and a knit. And then I counted the number of rows. And then from there, I decided how long the stockinette portion should be, because I was just going to do plain stockinette just like the rest of my sweater with some ribbing at the top. So I did, I think, 12 rows of stockinette and then finished with 6 rows of ribbing at the top before binding off in pattern. And of course I made sure I had an odd number so I could start and end with that knit stitch. Now when you're counting your rows, make sure you count 1 extra, because when you're sewing it together, that cast on row is sort of going to get eaten up in the seam. So just add 1 extra row to your count. Step 3 is to actually knit your patch pocket times 2. You want to make 2 of them, of course, if you're adding 2. So you're going to cast on the number of stitches you need to get the width that you want, knit the number of rows that you need, including any stitch patterns. You don't have to do your pocket in stockinette stitch. You can do an interesting stitch pattern if you want, but you do want to check to make sure it's the same gauge as that stockinette fabric or whatever fabric you're putting that pocket on. Finishing with that row at the rows of rib, and then I just bound off in pattern. Now one thing to remember is the first and last stitch needs to be slipped every 2 rows. So for that I just made sure I slipped the first stitch on every row with the yarn held to the wrong side of the work. And that gives you a nice slip stitch selvage that you're going to use to seam the pocket later on. Once you've finished knitting your pocket, I wove in the ends, and then you can wash and block it like you're going to take care of your finished sweater, but I was sort of in a hurry, so I just pinned it out and gave it a little bit of a steam. Depending on the fibers you're using, you might want to change that method, but some way to sort of uncurl those edges, make sure things are nice and flat so sewing is a little bit easier. So step 4, we're going to actually sew that patch pocket down to the cardigan. And I love sewing with knitting because if I mess up, it's not that big a deal. I can just pull it out and I can do it again. And I did that a few times with this. I had to pull things out and redo them. It's totally fine, and it happens to everybody. So the first thing to do is to thread a tapestry needle with the yarn you're going to sew it up with. I just used the yarn from my project, and you want a piece that's long enough to go around all 3 sides that you're sewing down, plus some extra for weaving in the ends. You're going to use 1 piece to do all 3 sides. That gives you only 2 ends to weave in. If we did everything separately, we'd have 6 ends to weave in. So we're going to use 1 long length. So I just threaded that. So you're going to leave about 1/3 as the length for the tail for that right side later on, and then you're going to sew with the rest of it. So you're going to start with the pocket. So go into the 2nd stitch in from the right edge. So you're going to skip over that selvage edge. We're going to use that for seaming the right side after. So go into that 2nd stitch, and we're 1 row above the cast on edge. You're going to go under both legs of that stitch. So your stitch looks like a V, and you're going to go under both legs of it on that pocket. So we're 1 stitch in from the selvage, and we're 1 row above the cast on edge. And we've gone under both legs of that stitch. And then on the cardigan, look at where you've outlined. You're going to go in 1 stitch from the right edge. That right edge stitch is going to be used to seam the right side. So we go in 1 stitch from that. Now, instead of going under both legs of this stitch, to make sure everything lines up, we're actually going to go down into the center of the stitch. So look at that V, you're going to go right down into the center of it and up through the center of the next stitch. And this sort of gets you set up. Now that you have these first 2 stitches all set up, what you're going to do is go in where you came out previously. So you're going to go back to the pocket where that yarn's coming out. You're going to go back under and under both legs of the stitch right beside it. And then you go to the cardigan and you go where that yarn is coming out, go down that center of that stitch and then back up through the next stitch. And that is all there is to it. You just want to make sure that you've set it up properly, and then you just continue that same line across both the pocket and the cardigan. So you're going under both legs on the pocket and then going in the center of the stitch and up through the center of the next stitch on the cardigan. And then just continue doing that all the way across. until you get to the last stitch, that selvage stitch that we've been slipping. We're going to leave that one alone. So you're going to finish with a stitch right beside it. And then when you've gone all the way across, you'll notice if you look, you've made a row of V's, and it should look like it's coming right out of the row underneath that's attached to the cardigan itself. And it just is continuing that line of stockinette. At this point, you can pull it tight. You finish that seam, and when you look at it now after it's pulled tight, it should look, I mean, it looks like it has a seam, but all of your stitches are lining up properly. So at this point, you should have a length of yarn on either side, and those long lengths are going to be used to seam each side. So I like to start with the left side, using that yarn we have. What we're going to do is sew together the bar on the back of that slipped stitch. If you flip it over, you'll find that there is a little smile basically, and you're going to use that stitch along that slipped stitch edge, and you're going to sew that to the center bar of every other stitch at the edge of your outlined area. So we're going to start with a cardigan. I go to that stitch that's right along that outlined edge, and we're going to look for the center of the V and pick up the bar that's right in the middle. We're going to go under that bar and back up to the top and pull the yarn through, and then we're going to look on the back side of our pocket. We're using that slip stitch edge. If you look and feel, you'll feel that there's like one bump that feels pretty sturdy right along the edge. The slip stitch doesn't feel very sturdy, but that stitch that's connecting it to the next stitch feels sturdier than the rest. So you're going to want to go under that bar, and then you repeat the process. You go back to the cardigan, but you're going to skip the next stitch and go to the bar above that one, and go underneath it and back to the front, and then go back to the pocket and pick up the next little bar along the back there, and then just keep repeating this up the side. It's very simple to do. Just pay attention to where you're picking up, and if you pick up in the wrong place, it's pretty obvious right away if it's too loose. You can just pull that one out and redo it. And then just remember to pick up every other bar on the cardigan itself, because that slip stitch edge is actually 2 rows of knitting, so we just want to make sure everything is even. When you get to the top, you can pull that tight, make sure everything looks good, and then take the yarn to the back of the work and repeat it for the other side. And then you can remove that waste yarn, weave in your ends, and if you want, you could either reblock the whole sweater or just use a little steam to set things to make sure they look really good. Adding afterthought pockets is not a difficult thing. It might be confusing or feel confusing when you're not used to looking at your knitting, but I encourage you to start paying attention to what's happening on your needles and learn to identify the stitches, the bars between the stitches, and really know how that knitted fabric is created. So when it comes to sewing things up or adding things like patch pockets, it's not that hard. And I promise you, it really isn't. You could do this with your cardigan. Knit a patch pocket and practice sewing it on. You're not going to ruin anything. The knitting will be absolutely fine, unless you're using something like a fuzzy mohair that's really hard to sew something like that. But try on a smooth wool yarn and you'll see how easy it really is. And I'm really happy with the results. I have pockets on my cardigan and didn't have to think about them while I was knitting the cardigan. I could add them later on. And that's not the only change I made. I did the same thing with the buttons on my cardigan. I did not add buttonholes when I was knitting it because I wasn't sure I wanted buttons. And then after the fact, I decided I did want buttons. And I found a way to add afterthought buttonholes to my cardigan. So click right there if you want to see how I did that. And I'll see you in the next video.